Oh, thank you. Welcome to Econ Thoughts, the podcast series of the Society for Professional Economists here in UK. I'm Filippo Gaddo, the host, and today I'm absolutely delighted to have as guest Jared Rubin, who is Professor of Economics at Chapman University, and we're going to have a conversation about the role of religion and culture on economic growth. Welcome, Jared.
Thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Exactly, fantastic. Before we get stuck into the session, it would be great if you can tell us a little bit more about your current role, what you do, and also how you got where you are today.
Yeah, sure. So, as you know, I'm an economic historian for the most part. I try to understand. Really, I've been long interested in how the world, certain parts of the world became rich and others did not. And one thing that I found in grad school, I'd always been kind of interested in religion as not somebody who's necessarily religious myself, but just I've been fascinated with it because its effect on just such a large part of the world's population. And in grad school, I stumbled into a class taught by somebody who become my advisor, Avner Greif, where he really showed the way that we can think about religion from both a theoretical and eventually empirical perspective, and its impact on economic growth in the very long run. And this kind of blew my mind. And it was something that I didn't even know economists studied when I went to grad school, but I decided this would be something I'd be doing for the rest of my career at that point. So large part, the most interesting things are things I'm most interested in are the way that religion affects economic growth, but mainly through politics. So really political economy being an important avenue through which religion affects economic outcomes, both in the short run and the very, very long run as well. And this is a field that, so I graduated with my PhD in 2007. At that time, there weren't a ton of people doing this, but it is a field that in the last 10 to 15 years, especially on the empirical side, there's been so much data becoming available and ways of analyzing the data becoming more and more novel. It's a field that's really been growing, both on the religion and more generally religion and culture. So I'm president of an organization called ASREC, the Association for the Study of Religion, Economics, and Culture. And this is an organization where almost all of the best papers in this field come through at some point. It's a rapidly growing organization. And I think one of the most exciting things about it is when you go to these conferences, it's very young. It's mostly assistant professors, graduate students, which for my take on it is it's a sign of a growing field, and a field that's going to be around a while. People that are really interested, and we're finally able to answer some of these questions that economists, I think, had avoided, for pretty good reason. For so long, we didn't really have good ways of conceptualizing culture and religion, certainly not good ways of analyzing it empirically. And we're getting much better at it now. And it's something, I think it's one of these things, and one of the reasons I wanted to say in the first is I think we all kind of recognize that culture and religion are important for economic outcomes and political outcomes and a whole host of other outcomes, but we never had a really good way of testing it before. And now we do. And because of this, we can now start to say, these types of things we know are important and really rigorously test them. And sometimes we're wrong, sometimes we're right.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's very, very interesting. And it's good, interesting the point that you say that it's been a rapidly growing area. And obviously, you can start maybe to assess the impact of religion on economic growth from the work that maybe from Max Weber and the kind of Protestant ethics. So probably that's kind of theory started there. And a lot of people still probably associate kind of religion and kind of an economic growth with that theory. Now, the next question would be, are we still there? How much has it changed since then? I know that over the years there have been a lot of different people. I mean, even from a point of view, he went from the Protestant ethic to Michael Novak writing about the Catholic ethic and the spirit of capitalism in the 1990s. And now obviously it's changed. How much has it changed since those days? Because from a lot of people, we're still stuck into that book as the one that will set the tone for the relation between those two thoughts.
Sure. It still has as you say, it kind of has a grasp on the kind of the people outside of the field that are not doing this work regularly. Absolutely, that's the first place they would go. Is Weber, Protestant ethic. That's the one tract that people have in mind. And it's one of these treks that I think has actually spurred on a lot of, it still does spur on a lot of research in the field. Not so much because we now think that a lot of what Weber was getting at was a kind of this classic example of a correlation that he probably got the causation wrong on. There was plenty of reasons. So, Weber grew up in Prussia, and he looked around where he was living, and he noted that the Protestant places, especially the Lutheran places, seem to be doing better than the Catholic places. And you could take that to a broader scale, so soon after the Reformation spreads, the Dutch, when they become independent, become the wealthiest place in the world. They're also Protestant. They eventually, in the 18th century, are taken over in terms of the world economically by the British, who are also Protestant. And in the 20th century, they're taken over by the US, also a Protestant country. So there's a correlation there in terms of some degrees of economic success and Protestantism. The question is, well, first off, is it causal at all? And if it is, what are the mechanisms? Weber, of course, put a very kind of almost scriptural / cultural mechanism, this idea of a work ethic really associated with Calvinism, and this idea of the elect. If you wanted to show that you were one of the elect, you had to have earthly success. So you work hard, you save, you do all these things that we do think of as important for economic growth. But there's been several challenges to that, to the thesis. I mean, beginning actually soon after Weber published it, you have people like Tawney questioning, well, really what he's describing as Protestant existed well before the Reformation. The Italian city-states, for example, were certainly capitalist, but were at their height really in many ways before the Reformation even began. And they were certainly Catholic. And there's been several papers recently that have begun to rigorously test different aspects of the Weber hypothesis. Probably one of the more well-known ones, the 2009 paper by Becker and Vossman, that look at the role that human capital, education in particular, played in Protestant Catholic differences. And they looked at the very place Weber was looking, Prussia, and they found that there was a difference between Protestant Catholics, but it was in their education levels. And one for education levels, there's not much more room for other factors like hard work. Of course, the question then is, well, why do the Protestants have higher education levels? And they do attribute that to Luther. Namely, Luther was a very big proponent of everyone being able to read. Not so much because he viewed it as beneficial for economic growth as we might think of it today, but because he wanted everyone to read the Bible. And early Protestants really invested in schools and Protestant schools, and they did so for boys and girls, whereas most education, in the 16th, 17th centuries was mainly boys. So that's a twist on the Weberian hypothesis for sure. It is consistent with the correlation he found, but gives a very different interpretation of why we see these differences.
Yeah, and in a paper, I think with the same two authors, Becker and Wisman, you looked at religion and growth, and you had a little bit of a model and you can look at the transmission channels. Maybe it'd be good if you can kind of outline very briefly which are those transmission channels, if they exist, between religion and growth. And it might be that sometimes there is a kind of spurious correlation between the two, and there is no causation. But in some cases, there may be some causation.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I think even going into that, before I get into the specifics of how we're thinking about it, I think one thing that is very clear in this literature is, for the most part, it's not so much doctrine that matters as much. It's not that we're saying that there's some types of religious, or not just we, but really most of the literature is not really found that it's not something about doctrine that leads certain societies to be well off. It's typically something about these other factors, which I'll get into in a second, that growth economists, development economists typically think of as contributing to economic growth. If we think of kind of basic economic production functions, which is how we organize this paper. So this is, as you mentioned, a paper. It's a survey paper with Becker and Bussman, the two guys I just mentioned. And so we take a basic production function. We say, look, when we think about at the both macro, certainly the macroeconomic level, but frankly even at the firm level, What are the inputs into productive activity? We have capital, we have labor, we could think of as, capital, certainly, physical capital, but then there's also human capital. And then there's technology, or, that kind of total factor productivity element, which is made up of many things. How there've been, what we do in this paper is to use that framework, the basic inputs into a macroeconomic production function, to say, well, does religion work through these different inputs? Does it affect capital? We start with physical capital. So you say, all right, well, with physical capital, one way to grow physical capital over time is investment earnings. And this is something that, to the extent that the Weberian hypothesis is correct, you might say, well, that's that could be part of it. In that part of the Weberian hypothesis is that because of these beliefs, Protestants are more thriftier, they save more. And there has been some evidence on supporting that aspect of the hypothesis. Now, again, whether it's because they have certain beliefs or whether they have certain access to institutions is actually still kind of an open question. And in any case, most growth economies moved away from physical capital investment as the primary driving force in the massive macroeconomic differences we see across societies. It's certainly important on some levels, but it certainly can explain kind of the big differences, the big divergences over time. When we're thinking about investment, there's also financial development that matters. Mm-hmm. In here, we might be thinking about, both Christianity and Islam, for instance. There were long bans on taking interest on loans, and this is something it's not just even though it is in the Quran, and there were early church councils that banned taking interest. This is also very much a political economy story of, when do secular rulers permit taking interest? When do they not? When do they need the church to, or or local imams to support them? When do they not? This is a story that the implications here are much deeper than just there's scripture that says one thing, so we don't do it. We have to understand why these things persist, or in some cases don't, because in Christianity, clearly, restrictions on taking interest were eventually disbanded, and really that process began in the late medieval period. So this would be, excuse me, a few examples of capital accumulation. I think a big one that beginning with this background investment paper, but this entire literature is taken off, is on human capital. Both education but also skills. Or generally, we see religious education, historically was the primary education that most people would have had, whether it be in Christianity. Most people in the medieval period, and frankly, even kind of moving into the early modern period that were educated, would have been part of the clergy or part of the elite, which obviously mattered. And then the early kind of primary and secondary schools were often religious. In the Muslim world, you have madrasas. There's a large madrasa movement. And when we think about then the role that religion might play in long-run economic development, human capital has been shown to be one of the primary. And so there's a set of very good papers on human capital in Judaism, but by Botticini and Eckstein, that look at the role that it really, and theirs is very much a cultural explanation, going back to the destruction of the Second Temple. Jews kind of moved away from farming and eventually into more highly human capital pursuits. These are things they kind of are able to trace through even to the present day. So again, this is not necessarily something, again, where we would say it's always about doctrine, but we have to consider how religion and like a political economy. There's also demographic factors, things like how many babies societies have that matter, and that clearly is influenced by religious factors, going back to not just doctrine itself, but interaction with local political and economic conditions. And then I think the big one that we actually spend quite a lot of time on is what I'm calling political economy, which is really the interaction between religion and politics. And this is something that especially in the part of the world dominated by the Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. There's been real intermixing of religion and politics. This would also be true, in places like China, to the extent that we consider to the extent we consider Confucianism a religion. Clearly that has played a massive role in shaping, Chinese politics, and the same would be true in some places. It would with Buddhism, Hinduism. These are we now have more kind of historical political data, but also data on the role that, or not the role that, but data on religious establishments that were really able to kind of make these connections in ways that we haven't been able to before. And for my money, and granted, this is mostly where my research lies, so I'm certainly biased, but I do think that ignoring the role of political economy when thinking certainly at the macro level, why the role that religion might have played in the long-run economic trajectory of certain societies really misses the boat if you miss out on political economy, because it's been so important, especially in the West, for understanding long-run trajectories.
And what particular on the political economy did the religion, particularly Christianity, for example, have? So what was the channel through which it may facilitate economic growth or potentially hinder it?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of what I think has been found is that, and again, some of this is my own work, so I'm biased here, but that when religious authorities are deeply involved in politics, largely because they're able to legitimate rule. If you're a Muslim ruler, you typically want powerful clergy on your side. If you're a medieval European ruler, you're quite unwise to upset the church or local bishops, things like this. And what that means is that religious authorities get some type of political power. And when we think about, well, who gets political power? Well, they end up getting things that they want now in return for legitimating the state, things like that. And why this matters is not so much that religious authorities necessarily want things antithetical to economic development. Oftentimes, and more importantly, they just want things that are kind of independent of economic development. They don't want things that spur it on, like secure property rights, or maybe investment in certain types of public goods like transport networks and things like this that are really good for merchants, or things that are really good for producers. They just want things like suppression of rival religions. They want things like tax exemptions. These are types of things that don't necessarily hamper economic growth, but they don't promote it either. And one thing that work by myself and others has shown is that in places where religious authorities became replaced by, especially in Europe, parliaments, because parliaments ended up being mostly comprised of people that for self-interested reasons wanted things that were good for economic development, like secure property rights, like investment in public transport networks, maybe even investments in military protection, things like that. These things do end up being more or better rather for economic development. And you just don't get them when those types of people don't really have a strong seat at the political bargaining table, which does happen when religious authorities are strong. These are things that monarchs or sultans or emperors only give them up when they kind of have to in order to stay in power. And as long as religious authorities are strong, they and can play a strong role in legitimating the state, they don't necessarily need to do that. So this would be one kind of, I think, and I would argue the most important channel through which religion and religious authorities really affect economic outcomes via politics.
And that's more on the negative side. Obviously, if regional authorities are particularly strong, they might kind of affect political economy negatively by actually kind of taking away a little bit of space for the development of some of the other institutions that might be promoting growth. Is there any a positive channel on the other side in terms of either providing legitimacy, increasing the level
definitely.
of trust?
So I mean, I think So the evidence is very mixed on on trust because trust is something to the economists and sociologists and anthropologists and whomever really consider two types of trust, one being trust of the in group and then one being trust of the out group. And economists really focus on trust on the out group as being really important because in order to engage in economic transactions at a wide scale, you need to be able to engage with people you don't know. And there, the relationship between religion and trust of the outgroup, I think, is something we've seen some mixed evidence on. I think for me, the most important mechanisms through which religion has really played a positive role on economic growth is through education, so human capital development. Even modern human capital development is really, especially when we're thinking in the West, is unthinkable without some role for religious organizations. So if you look, so I'm based in the US, a large fraction of US universities were at one point religious universities, for instance. Until really the early to mid 20th century, large fraction of people were educated in religious schools. The public school movement in the US and then eventually in Europe only becomes a thing really in the 20th century, and when we look at literacy rates, by this time, by the 19th century, in what became the rich world, literacy rates were rather high. This is something clearly that religious organizations can take credit for, or some credit for. I think another important place that religious organizations really going back in Christianity to the very early church even would be poor relief. Poor relief is something there's pretty good evidence that a decently robust system of poor relief encourages economic growth, mainly by allowing people to both, on the one hand, take risks, but also, especially in agricultural societies, survive, a bad harvest or two. And this is something that in nearly every part of the world where there's very strong religion, religious authorities have historically been the primary provider of poor relief. And I think that this is something that has been shown to, in different parts of the world, to at least not only be, historically the primary, or rather religions were the primary cause, but really a key source of growth in some places, and less so in others that had weaker systems of poor relief. And this is also a distinguishing factor between Catholicism and Protestantism. And so one reason why, so the Catholic was a big provider of poor relief. Protestant churches tended to not do as much, in part because they had different views on poor relief. They really distinguished between the deserving and non-deserving poor, but also because they're just less well-funded as well. So this is why you also see in Protestant states, from an early period, including places like England, the state eventually having to take over. And it's a big distinguishing factor between Catholic and Protestant states, especially in Europe.
Yeah, no, sure. No, that's very interesting. And in fact, education, obviously, as you mentioned earlier on, human capital, leading to human capital is one of the biggest driver of growth, at least as kind of outlined in current economic thinking and theory. You mentioned earlier on trust, and I think one of the proponent of the role of trust and how actually potentially religion has influenced that was the book by Joseph Henrich about the weirdest people in the world, where he talked about the European marriage pattern. You mentioned that in your book as well. And in a sense, in that kind of breaking a little bit in group by actually bringing a little bit of the out group by breaking a little bit that kind of kin-based kind of marriage pattern. You want to talk a little bit about some of that dynamic as well?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think that Henrik and he's working with a few others. Jonathan Schultz in particular has a few papers on this that I think are really compelling. And the idea that they propose is that the medieval church, and really for selfish reasons, they wanted to break up families in large part because bequests went to the church if there were no heirs, and it also allowed for families to not become too powerful in the church. What is historically in most parts of the world, including Europe, prior to the period they discuss, mainly kind of the High Middle Ages, kinship networks tended to be rather wide. So who you would consider as part of your kin wouldn't just be your nuclear family, parents and children and siblings, but aunts and uncles, maybe to second degree, third degree, things like this, cousins from a wide range. And what this does, and this has been kind of argued, I think, so by people like Greif and Tabellini in the case of China, it's been argued in the case of the Middle East, where kinship networks are much bigger, is it means, the way, there's a few implications of this. One is that, when we think institutionally, if I have a big kinship network, I don't need to go outside as much in case if I have an accident or at harvest, I can likely find somebody in my kinship network to help me through. So what that means is that there's not as much incentive for things like financial intermediation, banks to arise, things like that that are independent of kinship networks. So you have this rather large group of people that also you can trust. And to get to the question you're getting at, and also some of the stuff that Henrik and his co-authors find, there's social sanctions that can happen within a kinship network. If I cheat you and you're part of my kinship network, everyone in the kinship network is going to know about it, and I might get almost kind of kicked out, or they might not deal with me after that. What that means is that you can end up typically trusting people in your network because you know that they're not going to cheat you, because if they cheat you, they're getting kicked out. So what that means is that within places that have large kinship networks, you get a lot of in-group trust, what we were talking about before. Now, out-group trust typically is much lower in these networks because when we think of what is the out-group, it's people outside your kinship network. I don't have much reason to trust them. If I'm just interacting with them and I've never met them before, they actually have every incentive to cheat me. There's really no punishment for doing so. They might not have incentive to murder me. In fact, a lot of societies, especially kind of early societies, have punishments for doing serious crimes against people in the out group. There's kind of blood price, things like that. On the other hand, just small cheating, things like that, there's much more incentive to do so. So what there's been a lot of literature on this ends up showing is that outgroup trust is lower. So what the church did, so Henrik and Schultz and their work goes back at least to the anthropologist Jack Goody, who has this great book in the early 80s that really looks at what the church did in this period. Is they banned cousin marriage. So the way that groups keep kinship networks together is essentially by having cousin marriage. Sometimes first cousins, oftentimes second cousins, third cousins. It keeps land in particular in the family. What the church did is it banned cousin marriage, and formally up to at one point the sixth cousin, which would really actually kind of be impossible to know almost. I doubt you know who your six cousins are. I certainly don't. And especially when you're thinking about small villages with maybe 500-600 people, everyone is probably your sixth cousin or closer in that village. In a small medieval village, it wasn't enforced at that level. I mean, the sixth cousin stuff was mainly for allowing the church to selectively punish monarchs who went out of line, and they were certainly marrying very closely related people. But for the most part, what it did is it did allow, or it did incentivize even people at much lower levels, peasants, but particularly and probably more importantly, people just above the level of peasants. So maybe you might think of city dwellers who were maybe part of a guild or had some modicum of power, because what could happen is if they had some type of inheritance to be given, and they just so happen to want to marry maybe even their third cousin, somebody else in the family might be able to rat them out. So there was a huge incentive then to kind of break apart these things, to marry across lines so that you could not be ratted out. And what ends up happening from there, according to Goody, and then Henrik and Schultz and co-authors really take the argument a few steps further, is that you get the formation of really nuclear families at this point. The kinship networks don't matter as much because they break apart at marriage now. So nuclear families become important. And on the one hand, you might think this is a bad thing for what I just described, right? Because you have in societies with huge kinship networks, you have this large group of people you can trust because you know you can trust them because there's social sanctions and so forth. But what eventually this means is that societies have to start creating institutions that facilitate trust of the outside of groups from outside the kinship network. And the work of Avner Greif is really, I mentioned in the beginning, he was my advisor, is really really pushed that idea of, I think, several steps forward, that what you start to see in, especially, and it begins really in the Italian city-states in northern Italy, around this period, soon after you get the real breakup of kinship networks, are these kind of institutions like trade institutions, financial institutions that facilitate economic exchange between people from different kinship groups. And over time, what happens is, because people work much more often with people outside of their own kinship group, there begins to become, in these societies, and this is what Henrik and co-authors show, is greater trust between people, because you just have more interactions with them and more positive interactions with them. In part because what these institutions do is they incentivize people to act truthfully and act honestly. There's mechanisms for punishment if they don't.
Yeah.
And over time, that matters. I mean, we think of trust and interpersonal trust and kind of outgroup trust as being one of the hallmarks of a modern economy. It's very hard to have modern economic growth in a society where people really don't trust outsiders. I mean, there are a lot of societies where that's true today, and typically those are poor societies. Now, this is not to say that that's the reason they're poor. In fact, it is very much a vicious circle. Poverty can induce lack of trust as well, especially when there's bad governmental institutions. But this is something that I think is clearly one of those roles that religion, again, this is something we could say this was not intentional on the Catholic Church's part. It was certainly not something where they were hoping to inspire long-run economic growth. They did it for selfish reasons. They did it to increase the quest of the church, but it did have a massive impact on, at least certainly according to Henrik and Schultz, on the growth of the West.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's very helpful to outline that. And as you said, independently of what the reason was, it definitely had a big implication, and and is with us still today, as some of these works show. Just one point you raised earlier on was about today we can test some of these hypotheses a little bit better. What kind of, without going into too much details, because we might get too much into the weeds of the methodology, what particular tools and methodology, what has emerged that now allow us to do that? Is it because we get better data? Is it AI? Is it kind of the ability actually to explore text and books in a digital way, and therefore we can capture data? What is it in the last 10 years has shifted slightly the research, allowing us to do better work around the impact that religion might have on growth?
It's everything you just said. So a lot of it has to do with the opening of data. And this is clearly not just true of people studying culture and religion. It's true across all the social sciences. But but I think especially for people that are interested in historical questions, we just have a lot more data that has become available, large in part due to digitization. Even when I was doing my PhD, if you wanted, in the early 2000s, if you wanted real historical data, you almost always had to go to an archive, spend a lot of time, at that point, we had digital cameras, but, they weren't that great. You'd have to flip through pages and, you'd spend a few days there, get back, eventually put everything into a spreadsheet. And that was a very time-consuming process. And you would just get, one thing from one archive that wouldn't be able to tell you something necessarily massive, but it might be able to tell you something for the project you're interested in. Now this has all been digitized, and a lot of it has been OCR'd, which is the process through which a computer program actually reads it for you and puts it into machine, something that's machine readable. And from our computers, we now have access to massive amounts of data. Now, this, in some cases, you mentioned text as data, and actually text as data is something that we're really just scratching the surface of. And the thing with text as data, it's not just that so much of the world's written material has now been digitized, but we also have so much more computing power, which is really important for stuff like text as data, because you're talking about hundreds of thousands, and in many cases, even millions of lines of data that computers even 10 years ago really couldn't have handled. You would have had to really have gone to a massive supercomputer that just there weren't many available in the world. Now, some of this stuff I can do on my laptop. That's a very different thing that allows so many more researchers access to just different data than we had before. But and really, text as data, I think, is one of the next real frontiers in this literature, because when we think about culture and religion as well, a lot of it is embedded in our language. A lot of it is embedded in how we speak about things. And and also one thing that we have more so than just about anything in terms of texts are religious texts. Especially when you think about medieval Europe, nearly everything that was written was coming from either a monastery or a university, and a lot of what was being written in universities was being done in the theology department. So most of what we have, of course, it's almost all in Latin, but was being written by people with an interest, or oftentimes just part of the church. So that by far is the most kind of important reason why we have more data than ever. But we also have, with digitization, it's not just about old text, it's about digitization of censuses, for instance. So you're going back to, say, the Becker and Wussmann paper. What they use are digitized censuses, Prussian censuses from the 19th century that are incredibly detailed, that fortunately for the types of questions they were asking, have data on Protestants versus Catholics. They have data on schools. They have data on literacy rates, and it's disaggregated by religion. Which is, of course, incredibly useful. And they, as well as others, have used this, Prussian data to really answer a lot of questions about what was going on in Central Europe at the time. And we're seeing more data like that become available as well. We mentioned human capital is really a way that religion has played a very positive role, I think, in economic development and educational facilities. What was being taught and in religious schools, we just have so much better idea of now, in large part because of digitization and stuff that would have been almost stuff you would have had to spend an entire career doing before. You can now do, in really a few months to a year, because so much of the legwork is already out there.
Yeah, no, that's thank you for that. That's obviously is a process that's ongoing, and more research, obviously, with more material available, more data and more analysis can also be done. Before we wrap up at the end, one question which is around policy implication of the work. What is it? It's very interesting, obviously, to look backwards and understanding the role of kind of the religion had through culture and through other mechanisms, and onto growth and economic development. And from an economic historical point of view, you can never see the benefit. What practical application from the policy side can be done by that analysis? What will it drive? How, if you were to think about a conversation with a policymaker or with businesses, what will this kind of learning actually help you with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there could be several, depending on which strand of literature you're interested in. I mean, I think maybe we'll just, to kind of in the spirit of our discussion so far, take one positive and one negative. I think on the positive, it's we've talked about human capital education a lot here, but because I think it has been historically and continues to be a really important channel through which religion not only affects a society's level of human capital, but does so in a way that would not happen if not for the religious establishment. Because that's really, when as social scientists, we think about relative to the counterfactual.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important when we think about the type of education a lot of people get, especially people that are very religious themselves. It is really important to have the religious component in. And I think that facilitating that as a government policy is really important. Now, of course, my kind of old school, like 17th, 18th century Enlightenment style liberal in this case, like I don't think that we should be privileging one religion over another, but I certainly think that facilitating, whether it be through tax policy or subsidies, things like this to religious education is one of the best things that most societies can do. But beyond, of course, providing their own style of public education, but that I think has been clearly shown across different religions as well. Protestant, Catholic, Muslim, Jewish, certainly in the West at least, to be one of the most productive policies that a society can have is really kind of not just completely taking over, the state completely taking over religion. On the negative side, I do think that in those societies, and this is, I think, I don't know exactly if this is a policy prescription, but it's really kind of a way of thinking about modern political economy. It's still true, I think, in those societies where religion and religious authorities in particular, so not just religion, but religious authorities play a major role in the actual politics of the state, whether it be, and this doesn't necessarily mean that, it's a theocracy. I'm not talking about pure theocracy where it's a religious authority actually leading, like in Iran or something like that, but where it is, in a state where you might think it's impossible to imagine a ruler, whether it be a prime minister or whatever, ruling without the support of the important religious authorities. So even in Turkey, where you have a religious, where it's really hard to imagine, Erdogan staying in power if he lost the support of the clergy. This is something that clearly has, on at least on net, been a negative for economic growth. And in many of the states where we've seen these types of even reversals, there has been, I would say, probably an overabundance of religious or influenced by religious authorities. Again, I want to distinguish between religion and religious authorities here, because so in a place like the U.S., which is relatively religious, at least relative to Western Europe, there are no single religious authorities that you have to have on your side, right? I still don't think it's probably a great idea for a presidential candidate to just come out as an open atheist in the U.S. So religion obviously still does play a role, but religious authorities have relatively limited power, economic power, and I think that that's been important to U.S. economic growth. And so I think if we're looking, if you were to put me as an advisor to a country that where religious authorities do have significant power, that would certainly be something I would advise, at least, slowly reducing, figuring out ways to think about, while not changing by any means the religious composition, and by completely respecting the religious wishes of the population, and again, even thinking about contributing to religious schools and things like this, and really thinking about, well, what are the positive things that religion and religious authorities do provide. Reducing political power seems to be, again, this what this literature broadly suggests as well, an important key for economic growth.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's been very helpful. My last question, just to close, a brief answer is, and it might be a bit of an unfair question, but I'll do it anyway. Does it get quite tense sometimes to talk about religion and growth? What do I mean? A lot that used to be to say that you don't, particularly in the office, you don't talk about politics and religion and all. Does it sometimes, do you get the feeling that you're getting into territory which is quite controversial, or normally in the community of people that work, for example, in ASREC, is it relatively kind of normal actually to talk about the topics?
In the academic community, it's quite normal. Because I think in most of the people that say, come to our ASREC conference are just people I would consider, social scientists with no real agenda. And that's the key, because there are social scientists with an agenda. And in fact, I'd say in the early days of ASREC was founded by my colleague, Larry Iannacone, who's one of the founders of the Economics of Religion. In the early 2000s, I think it was in 2000 was the first conference. And in the early days, I know, I wasn't at some of these, I was still in grad school at some of these conferences, but there were certainly people that, wanted, to show certain good aspects of Christianity or good aspects of Islam. not because it was an interesting social science question, but because they had an agenda.
Yeah.
And that's where I think as social scientists, we really can't tread. We really want to, we might have priors on whether religion is good or bad. As our conversation suggested, my own prior is that it's sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes neutral. I mean, it really matters the context. But I also, as a social scientist, am willing to have those priors changed with convincing evidence. And I think that's a lot of what we see in the academic community. Now,
Yeah.
some of my work has reached a little outside the academic community, and they're treading carefully is important, because one thing that academics, I think, do well when talking with other academics, but don't do so well when talking with the general public, is give nuance. Because a lot of these discussions that we've been having even here are nuanced. It's not
Yeah.
just that religion good or religion bad. It's under certain conditions and due to certain mechanisms, religion might contribute to economic growth or it might detract from economic growth. That often gets lost when
Yeah.
talking in a more public forum. And because of that, you really have to tread carefully, because really, even so, for instance, my own work, I've worked a lot on Islam in the Middle East. And in some cases, what my research suggests is that there have been aspects of, in the first part of the sentence, you're going to see why you have to tread carefully. There have been aspects of Islam which have been detrimental to economic growth. So you just say something like that,
Yeah.
and very rightfully so, people, say, well, well, what are you talking about? This is just another, Western scholar that's anti-Islam. But then really what my research actually says, though, and this is where the nuance matters, is it's not Islam itself. There's almost really nothing about the doctrine of Islam. And in fact, Islam is so much closer to Christianity in almost every respect that matters for economic growth than it is different. The big mechanism in my work, at least, has been through political economy, namely the role that major religious authorities have played in the politics of the state. That, I think, is a much less controversial statement. And in fact, there's plenty of people living in the Islamic world today that I don't think would disagree with such statements, in part because they live in societies where religious authorities do have a major role in politics. But that's a massively important distinction, because I would agree on being offended on the first part of the statement, because without real strong evidence, and I don't really think there's really strong evidence. So the works of Timur Kuran, for instance, who has looked at the role Islamic law has played in slowing economic growth in the Middle East, really, in the end, he shows it's also through institutions. And it's the institutions that are, so he looks in his most recent book, for instance, at the institution was the Waqf, which was, a trust that became an extremely important way of storing money in the Middle East. He shows that it had all of these negative effects. This is not something that is written into the Quran. It's not something that's really part of doctrine. It's an institution that emerged in early Islam. But on the other hand, that nuance often gets lost. And I think it is a challenge for people that are academics in this field, especially not so much when we're talking with each other, because we know the nuance there, and we know that for the most part, people are not coming in here with an agenda one way or the other. But when talking with the public, which in the end I think is one of the most important things we do is summarizing our research and the main strands of research for public consumption. And especially policy consumption is incredibly important. And also, I would say on this point, it's also incredibly important to not let people who do have bad motives, who do, especially with what I study with, in Islam, there are a lot of people that really want to blame Islam for a lot of things. And a very extremely superficial reading of my work or Quran's work would allow them to do that. But that would be a complete misreading of what our work says too, which is why it is important, and again, it's not just myself and Quran. I think it's almost everyone working in the social sciences in this field. It's really important that we get through what exactly is being said, because I would never get over it. I think if there was a massive policy that used my work as inspiration, but used it in the exact wrong way from what the findings are meant to be said. And as you know, as I said, when there's nuance to a finding, it really can be hard. And so I've received pushback, but whenever I receive that type of pushback, you know, I always try to explain to the best I can. Look, you know, what I'm actually saying is the opposite of what you think I'm saying.
Yeah. No, that's very important. Unfortunately, though, we live in a world where sometimes the nuance gets lost a lot, especially
Oh yes.
when you get on Twitter called X, and you have to limit yourself to 20 characters, 170 characters, and then suddenly the nuance get lost. But I think you're definitely doing a great job, actually, by looking at your profile as well, and all the work you've been doing with Azurek. So, Jared, thank you very much. It's been a great conversation, and we'll definitely kind of continue to have that conversation, and we'll look forward to all your work. And I'll put on our page as well some of the link to the work that your work and the one from your colleagues, and also the one you mentioned in the show today. So thank you very much.
Filippo, it's been fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.